Hello again, everyone. Nice to be with you once more for this fourth session of Theosophy Raw and Unfiltered, which, as you can see, I've called the Universal Oversoul and the Yoga Sutras. I'm sorry about those diacriticals. In translation from Australia to Chicago, my diacriticals get munged, but never mind. So today we're going to be looking at the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, but I'm going to be starting by taking a step back to Vedanta, which for Patanjali would have been something of a primary source and background knowledge and background assumptions. And if we understand a little bit more about what is meant by the self in Vedanta, we will understand a lot more about the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Now, the phrase universal oversoul there is something that I've taken from HPB's third fundamental proposition, which posits a fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul. And we should definitely not take the word soul there literally, or take it to mean anything like the soul in, modern day psychology or psychoanalysis. It really is the self, or the Atman. So it is saying in the third fundamental proposition exactly what Shankaracharya taught, that ultimately there is no difference between Brahman and Jiva. Jiva is the embodied self. It's the same as saying ultimately there is no difference between Atman and Brahman. We have to note there the word ultimately. Maybe sometimes we skip over that where it says ultimately there is no difference between Brahman and Jiva. Ultimately is very important because ultimately does not necessarily mean now in my present state. Ultimately, even now, there is no difference between Brahman and Jiva, but there's something missing. And what is missing is my knowledge of this fact, my awareness of this fact, my felt intuitive understanding or feeling of this fact. So that's ultimately. And how to get to ultimately is the subject matter of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which is really the applied science of Vedanta. The Yoga Sutras are the applied science of Vedanta and also the applied science of Theosophy. Or we might say that Raja Yoga, which is the subject matter of the Yoga Sutras, is the applied science of Theosophy. And that is certainly how HPB treated it. In the third fundamental proposition, HPB says nothing about how to get to how to get to ultimately, rather. She doesn't say a lot about how to get there in the Secret Doctrine or Isis Unveiled. How is not the main subject matter of the Secret Doctrine. What is the main subject matter? What is happening and what has happened? To a slightly lesser extent, how. But the Patanjali Yoga Sutras is all about the how, and that's what we're going to be looking at in a moment after we do a little bit of a recap of the fundamental position of Advaita Vedanta. That's very interesting. I didn't check this before, but the picture in that blank square is an illustration of a friend of mine's, but this does just as well because this is a picture of somebody not knowing the real self, and I suppose this is a good enough way as any of depicting that, a blank white square. So the fundamental disease in Vedanta is ignorance. Our fundamental problem is ignorance or avidya. And that is described in Vedanta as the real self is not known. So it's not like ignorance of Greek or mathematics or geometry, something specific. It's ignorance of something very specific, and that is the real self. So that is our fundamental problem, the fundamental disease. And what are some of the symptoms of this disease, that the real self is not known? Well, the real self, the self that you really are, is full or purna. it's not lacking anything. It is, Purna means full, complete, infinite, whole. So the self that you really are is infinite and complete and not lacking anything. And some of the symptoms of not knowing the real self, which is Purna, is that constant, permanent, underlying sense of lack, fueling much of our behavior, the sense of lack. I always miss something in life. I miss people, I miss objects, I miss places, I feel I miss out on things. There's this sense of lack and missing underlying much of our actions in life, and that is because the real self is not known. That is because we haven't gotten to ultimately yet. Ultimately, there is a fundamental identity of the embodied self, which is the me, and the real self, which is full, complete, not lacking anything. So the fundamental problem in Vedanta and in Theosophy is not a lack of identity, it is not a lack of the self, it is a lack of knowledge of the self. So again, the fundamental problem here is avidya, or lack of knowledge. Who do you think you are? That is a question beloved of genealogy shows, which I don't really watch, but I've noticed that one of them is called Who Do You Think You Are? And of course that show is all about people's ancestry, tracing back as far as they possibly can. So generally speaking, people answer the question inwardly, who do you think you are, they refer to their ancestry, their present family and their past family, their likes and dislikes, their ambitions, their job, how their house looks even. You know, we identify even with the colour of the paint on our walls, our possessions. You know, in response to the question, who do you think you are, we are apt to point to our body and think of our minds, our thoughts. But all of these things, my ancestry, my likes and dislikes, my ambitions, my present circle of family and friends, my possessions, my body and my thoughts, they all belong to the vehicle, not to the being. They belong to the upadhi, not being. These things here on the right, ancestry, likes and dislikes, ambitions, job, all of that, is in the world of the falsity of the world, category mithya. These are all nama, rupa, karma, name, form and function. They are the name, form and function of the being. They are not the being. These are descriptions of the vehicles in which we ride. These are the descriptions of the horse on which we ride, which is not an insignificant entity, but is still not who you really are. It's who we think we are. So now let's look quickly at who we really are according to Vedanta, according to Shankaracharya, and according to H.P. Blavatsky. So who you are according to Vedanta. First of all, we need to delete everything beginning with my. So we delete ancestry, we delete likes and dislikes, we delete opinions, we delete ambitions, we delete our job description, we delete family, we delete friends, we delete possessions, we delete the body. You are not the body or the mind is a sort of a slogan in Vedanta. Who are you? You are not the body or the mind. So first of all, we delete everything beginning with my. I mean, we don't actually delete them with like an AK-47 or something, but we delete them conceptually. If you want to conceive of what is your real self, then conceptually you delete all these things. That's a good beginning. But then we have to see that we have to delete my as well. It's not just the particular things attached to my, it's my. My stands in the way of I. That's a slogan of mine. It's not a very poetic one, but my stands in the way of I meaning seeing. Krishnaji had a saying, where the me is, love is not. We could also say where the me is, the self is not, or where my is, the self is not. And the self is seeing, among other things. So the real problem doesn't lie in our bodies our minds, our experiences, any objects or lack of objects. It doesn't lie in thoughts. Our problem is not the appearances. Our problem is the fact that the appearances conceal that boundless being which is your real self. The problem is not the existence of the world. The problem is that we have not been trained to look beyond the sensory world to that which is the real behind it. The world, the falsity of the world, category mithya, is a projection of the self, and it veils the self. Just like when you go to the cinema, that which is projected onto the screen veils the screen. You know, when you first get there and the curtain opens and there's no images, you can see the screen. But as soon as the projector starts up and the images go onto the screen, you don't see the screen at all. So it's like that. The images project what is doing the projecting, and the images project what is more fundamental, and that is basically our fundamental problem. Now here is a very radical proposition from Shankaracharya in Atma Bodha, and I've titled this slide, "An ignorance virus can be killed only by one medicine, and that is knowledge." This is a saying I got from Swami Prabhavananda in Chennai. An ignorance virus can be killed only by one medicine, and that is knowledge. It's very important when you are ill to diagnose the illness correctly, otherwise you're going to be taking the wrong medicine. It's the same in life. It's very important if avidya or ignorance is our problem, then what is required is knowledge. And knowledge of something quite specific, not just any knowledge, and knowledge in a particular way, which we will see in a moment. So this is one of the shlokas, one of the 29 shlokas of Atma Bodha by Shankaracharya. And it says, "As fire is the direct cause of cooking, so knowledge, and not any other discipline, is the direct cause of liberation. For liberation cannot be attained without knowledge." I'll read that again. As fire is the direct cause of cooking, so knowledge and not any other discipline is the direct cause of liberation. For liberation cannot be attained without knowledge. So using the analogy or metaphor of cooking, it says here that fire is the direct cause of cooking. Now there are other things required if you're going to cook a meal. You need a vessel in which to put the ingredients, you need the ingredients, you need a cook, you need a spoon to stir it all with. But fire is the direct cause of cooking. Without fire or applying the Agni Tattva, the heat element, whether it's through a microwave or a gas cooker, it doesn't make any difference. Fire is the only absolutely necessary thing if you're going to be cooking. Otherwise it's like raw salad or gazpacho or something. So liberation cannot be attained without knowledge. And in fact, liberation cannot be attained without fire either, in a different kind of way, like tapas. It's the energy, the heat behind all of this, which is applied. It's the result of our desire for liberation, our longing for liberation. But here it just says simply, as fire is the direct cause of cooking, so knowledge and not any other discipline is the direct cause of liberation. This is a point, a teaching that Shankaracharya made in every single text he composed, or originally it might have been oral, but every single teaching of Shankaracharya's includes this particular fact. And for example, in the Viveka Chudamani, there is this wonderful, perfectly complete sentence embracing the teaching where it says, actions are for the purification of the heart, not for the attainment of the real substance. Actions, or karmas, are for the purification of the heart, not for the attainment of the real substance. The substance can be attained by right discrimination, not by any amount of karma. And the substance is the self. I love the way the translator has used the word substance, because it relates very closely to that teaching in the Mahatma letters, where it says there is only one law, one life, and one element. One element is the same thing as saying one substance. The one element or the one substance is the self, Atma, out of which everything is made in this world, just like clay is the substance or the element or the self of all clay pots. So that's an analogy given in Vedanta quite often, the pot analogy, Shankaracharya's pot analogy. Just as clay is the self of all pots, and just as gold is the self of all jewelry, so Atma is the self of everybody. So who you really are is not the body or the mind. Who you really are is the self. And the way to see that, the way to reach that, the way to get to that ultimately is not through any amount of actions. It is through direct seeing. Now there's a bit of a paradox here, an apparent contradiction, which we will look at in a moment, but this is the fundamental teaching. As fire is the direct cause of cooking, so knowledge and not any other discipline, not any other action, is the cause, the direct cause of liberation. Action cannot destroy ignorance, for it is not in conflict with ignorance. Action cannot destroy ignorance, for it is not in conflict with ignorance. And we will see when we get to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras that this is very literally the case. Action is always the product of ignorance. It is not the cure for ignorance. We will look at that in a moment. Knowledge alone destroys ignorance as light destroys darkness. Knowledge alone destroys ignorance as light destroys dense darkness. It destroys the pitch ignorance in which we live as well. It is only because of ignorance that the self appears to be finite. It is only because of ignorance that the self appears to be finite. When ignorance is destroyed, the self, which does not admit of any multiplicity whatsoever, truly reveals itself by itself, like the sun when the cloud is removed. I wonder if anybody listening to this remembers a statement by Erwin Schrödinger, which is the same as here it says, when ignorance is destroyed, the self, which does not admit of any multiplicity whatsoever, reveals itself. It was Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel laureate, who came up with this wonderful saying, this pithy saying, that consciousness is a singular which admits of no plural. Consciousness is a singular which admits of no plural, same as Atma Bodha. The self does not admit of any multiplicity whatsoever. There is only one self. There is only one substance. So who we think we are, which is basically the body-mind complex, is not the real self. The real self is uniform everywhere. The real self we all hold in common. It is only at that level that there is any truth to the first object of the Theosophical Society, which posits a universal brotherhood of all humanity, regardless of any kind of distinctions, regardless of race, creed, sex, caste or colour. It is at this level that universal brotherhood is a fact in nature, not at any other level. And we will look at that in session 6, when we come to look at a little bit more closely at the objects and the work of the Theosophical Society. So when ignorance is destroyed, the self by itself just reveals itself, just like the sun appears to come out from behind the clouds, but the sun didn't move at all. It's just that the clouds moved. Incidentally, two of the favorite scriptures of Schrödinger were the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, and I read just yesterday that he named his dog Atman, so he also had quite a good sense of humor. So what is revealed by itself when the stains are removed? What is the Atman? Now we're going to start looking a little bit more closely at what is the makeup of our real self. In the Atma Bodha, it says, what is revealed by itself when the stains or clouds are removed is Atma. Atma is the self of everybody. The image there is of a painting of some extraterrestrial saints, icons of saints from another planet, painted by a close friend of mine, placed behind a wheelbarrow of broccoli. So when the wheelbarrow of broccoli is removed, then the Atma, which is the self of everybody, is revealed by itself. And what is the Atma? Now we all know, I'm just going to skip back a stage here, we have all heard probably that saying that the only thing that is ever used to describe Brahman, or the ultimate reality, is Sat Chit Ananda, pure contentless consciousness, intelligence and bliss. There are other things also that we can say about the Atman, just from the etymology of the word, and these are very interesting as qualities of Atma, what you really are, the real self of everybody. There are apparently 4 roots in the word Atman from which the word is derived. Up, to pervade; ada, to resolve; ad, to experience; and at, that which ever exists. So the teaching goes is that Atma, which is the self of everybody and also the innermost essence of the universe, when it is called Brahman, pervades everything like the one element out of which it is made. So Atman is that which pervades everything and everywhere. Also, at the end of a life, at the end of a world, at the end of a manvantara, everything in the falsity of the world, everything that had been projected out of this one element is resolved back into it. So the word there is to resolve, that into which everything is resolved in the end. For example, you have a small clay teacup, and when you finish drinking with it, you just chuck it on the ground. So one minute the clay cup was there, and the next minute it is just resolved back into the earth. But the clay, the substance of which it was made, was the same before the pot was made, while the pot existed, and after the pot has been smashed back into the ground, the clay remains the same. Also, in the word Atma is at, that which ever exists. So again, the clay always exists, before, during, and after the pot. Likewise, the self that we really are, the innermost essence of the human being, exists before the vehicles were projected out, during the vehicle's incarnation, and after the vehicles had been reabsorbed. The self that you really are always exists. Now, why is this important? It wouldn't be that important to us other than as a mere intellectual curiosity if this only kicked in at the end of a manvantara, or at the end of a world, or the end of our lives. But it can kick in now. It does actually kick in now in many different ways. For example, let's look at the word resolve. I take that to mean not only that the self is that into which everything is resolved, I take it also to mean it is only at that level of ultimate reality, of the real self, of the Atman. It is only at the Atmic level that any problems are resolved, any conflicts are resolved. We all recall that statement attributed to Einstein that the mind that creates the problem cannot be the one that solves the problem, or something like that. Our problems cannot be resolved at the level at which they were created. So at the level of the vehicles in which they were created. things just get more and more messed up at that level. The way to really resolve conflicts is to transcend the level of the mere vehicles in which these problems have arisen and which have caused these problems. We need to pitch our solutions rather higher. That's an understanding that permeated the deep ecology movement, that it's going to take a lot more than just raising the height of smokestacks to solve the environmental problematic. It's going to take a radical transformation of society and the individual as well. And that is certainly the case. So it is only the self that you really are that can resolve your problems, that can heal us, really fundamentally heal us. It is not my ambitions, my jobs, my desire body and all of that that is really going to resolve conflict, even is going to resolve any conflict, socio-political, economic conflicts, the lot. But how do we get to this self? How do we get to this, what is really a big payoff if you think about it? There isn't anything said here so far as how. There is something very important and instructive in the Katha Upanishad, which may have been mentioned in a previous session, where it points out how not to proceed, where it says the self is not to be sought through the senses. The self-caused pierce the openings outward, therefore one looks outward and not within oneself. Some wise man, however, seeking life eternal, with his eyes turned inward, saw the self. So the self is not to be sought through the senses. I made a joke, I think, previously or somewhere recently, where it's a kind of like a design flaw where the senses are poking outward or opening outward, and therefore we look outward and not within. But here, some wise man, some disciple, seeking life eternal and seeking a solution to intransigent problems in the world, with his eyes turned inward, saw the self. And we already had some indication of what that self is. Now we get to how. How. We can see how not to, and we can see that how involves turning inward, and throughout theosophical literature, throughout New Age, throughout pop psychology, we always come across this phrase, look within. But there isn't much to say what is meant by looking, because obviously it's not the kind of looking we do as applied to the outer sensory world. It's a different kind of looking. So we need to understand in the phrase look within what is meant by looking. And we also need to understand what is meant by within. Where is within, or how do we get to within? And that is really the subject matter of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So now we begin what is really meant to be the real subject matter of this session, an introduction to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which I'm doing because, along with Vedanta, Shankaracharya's teachings, the Yoga Sutras are one of the fundamental background building blocks of Theosophy, and not necessarily explicitly so, but the background understanding of the authors of the Mahatma letters and the authors of the Secret Doctrine. So now we come to the beginning of the book, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And these are the first three of the sutras after the initial one, which just says, now an exposition of yoga. Please don't read the left of that slide yet. Let's just focus on now an exposition of yoga. Why does the Patanjali Yoga Sutra start with a basic simplistic statement, now an exposition of yoga? This reminds me very much of being, say, at a dinner party, a 3-course meal, and you have the entree you have the main course, and then someone comes out and says, now the dessert. Now the dessert. So now generally means something has gone beforehand, but this text begins with now, an exposition of yoga. There is nothing before the exposition of yoga in this text, and that's because it is given knowledge. The teachings that we've been looking at in this webinar are given knowledge. And if they were not given knowledge before the teacher sat down with the pupil to recite the Patanjali Yoga Sutras and give all the background, it would be given by the teacher. So now an exposition of yoga means now, after we understand what is the fundamental problem here, what is your real problem, what is the world's real problem, and that is that the real self is not known. Now we come to an exposition of yoga, the applied science of the teachings about the real self is not known. This is the applied science of Vedanta. And it begins with what seems to be a very simple statement, and which I suggest is the only essential statement in the Yoga Sutras. Almost the entire text is an exposition, an unfolding of this one sentence that says yoga is the inhibition of the modifications of the mind. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. The chitta vrittis are the modifications of the mind. You can think of them very simply as movements in the mind, and movements in the mind are thoughts. Every movement in the mind is a thought, an opinion, a wish, a description. So yoga is the inhibition or cessation of all the movements in the mind. And what happens when there is no movement in the mind? In that state of deep, silent space, the seer, or we could say here the self, is established in his own essential nature. Now there's a few important things here. In the absence of any modifications of the mind, and underneath all of the modifications of the mind, but unbeknownst to us, the seer is established in his own essential nature. The own essential nature, the svarupa of Atman, is seeing. That is why it's awareness. It is the background witness, that which is the real witness, the real experiencer behind everything is the Atman, or the seer, the eternal watcher. So you can see here again a complete confluence between Vedanta and yoga, although in yoga the expression used here is the seer, not the self, not Atman, but the Atman is the seer. The Atman is the witness. And when there is no modifications of the mind, the modifications of the mind are also the false world, the temporary projection. When there is no projection, the seer that you really are is just chilling, is just established in his own essential nature. In other states, so whenever there is any movement in the mind, wherever there are any thoughts, in other states there is assimilation with the modifications. In other states there is assimilation with the modifications. Now, it's not the seer that gets assimilated with the modifications. It is you that assimilate the seer with the modifications, and therefore don't see the seer. That's quite an important point. It's not the seer that gets confused when a thought arises in your mind. It is not the Atman that gets identified with the thoughts. It's the lower self that gets identified with the thoughts, or rather, it's the lower self that fails to see that these thoughts are just a temporary projection. And this is a very important teaching too, because all of us have been conditioned to believe that our thought, that thinking is the highest capacity for the human being. This was what came out in the Enlightenment, the other Enlightenment, not the Enlightenment that we're talking about here. That thinking is our highest capacity. But as we have seen before, thinking is not our highest capacity. Seeing is our highest capacity. The seer is our highest capacity. The seer that is behind the thoughts. So we need to see behind the thoughts. We need to see behind the modifications of the mind. And again, it's not a question of suppressing thoughts. The thoughts get inhibited, but they don't get inhibited by force. They get inhibited by a higher authority. They get inhibited naturally when you see the seer. Then the thoughts are silenced. The thoughts are quieted. And lots of times people ask questions like, well, are we supposed to not have any thoughts? It's like being brain dead. And how will I get from A to B without thoughts? We need thoughts. There is no question here of not having thoughts. Anybody who thinks that they will be free of thought is deluded. The only way to be free of thought is not have the thoughts stop, but to move on from there. It's like moving on to something else, to another level of reality. It's learning to perceive the screen on which the thoughts are projected. Again, it comes back to that all-important first step on the path, first and last step, which is viveka, or discrimination or discernment. And what we are to be it's not so much, I think, we often hear it's to discriminate between the real and the unreal, the false and the true, whatever. But it's not just a question of becoming discerning, like what is more important in life, where should I be focusing my energies, what should I be spending my time on, that kind of thing. That's certainly discerning. But discernment in the Yoga Sutras and in Vedanta is about discerning the real self. It is the capacity to see the seer, to see the screen behind the images. It's becoming aware of that seer. And becoming aware of the seer takes a certain amount of skill, but we all already possess that skill. It's not rocket science, but it's subtle. It takes a bit of subtle perception to see the seer, but it can be done by any of us participating in this webinar, and may have been done by some of us participating in this webinar sometimes, and then you move away. And it's one of the most astonishing things in I don't know, in spiritual life or the history of religion. One of the most astonishing things is that someone who could be in that state for a moment or a week or a month, where they are aware of the seer and therefore completely content and totally unstressable, and you don't care, you don't mind what happens. You just don't mind what happens. So you're perfectly okay with whatever happens because your consciousness is aware of the witness behind everything. You're just in that state of awareness, and you find that you're working more efficiently, that you look 10 years younger. Everything you want for nothing. It's just as, the teaching in Atma Bodha. We only have this sense of lack because the real self is not known. But it is possible for someone to know that real self for a moment, for a week, a couple of weeks, and you would think in that state, you would bet everything you owned that you will never move away from that state. Like, why would you ever move away from that state? And the next thing you know, you've moved away from that state. It takes a lot of training, and it takes a lot of faith not to ever move away from that state. And what I mean by that is, the more faith we have, if you're fortunate enough in a meditation session or in any other time of your life, to be in that state, we need to cultivate that state. We need to cultivate our understanding of it, and we need to cultivate our staying there. And we need to grow our faith that the most important thing when you are in that state is not to move away from it. And that might seem obvious, but something might come up, a conflict that you're involved in, or a tragedy, or suddenly you find that you're getting very upset. If you had 100% faith that the most important thing, the best thing in life, is to stay in that state where the seer is established in his own essential nature, or you're aware of the seer, or you're seeing the seer, you have some sense of the seer. If you were aware, if you had 100% faith that that was the most important thing, you wouldn't move away from it to get involved in that conflict or problem. And as soon as you started feeling upset about something, or whatever it is, you would immediately just drop it and move back to the seer. But we don't have 100% faith in this teaching. And so that's why things like these webinars are very important, or studying the teachings, keep going back to the original teachings. There was a wonderful talk I listened to once by the healer and kind of positive thinking guy, Joseph Murphy. I don't remember if I mentioned this in a previous session, but it has always stuck with me when I heard this on an old tape of Joseph Murphy's, where he was teaching about something. I think he was saying, the kingdom of heaven, you should, go out onto the mountaintops, shout from the mountaintops that the kingdom of heaven is within. Shout it from the mountaintops. But he said, first of all, you need to teach your own disciples. Before going out and teaching the rest of the world, first of all, teach your own disciples. And then he said, your disciples are your thoughts. So he said, preach that the kingdom of heaven is within you. But first of all, preach it to your own disciples. Your disciples are your thoughts. And that is so very true, because many of my thoughts understand this teaching and believe in it 100%. But not all of my thoughts do. We are all filled with so many thoughts that are ignorant, unproductive, conditioned thoughts that we grew up with, thoughts that we got from the rest of society. We're all full of a lot of contradictory thoughts. So the first person to teach these truths that we understand and love is ourselves. We have to keep teaching ourselves over and over again until we are one-pointed, we are integrated with this. And then there is no more moving away. There is just no more moving away. But that's a wonderful thing, I think, for all of us to remember in the TS, and take forward into our work in the TS, that whatever it is that we are teaching, preach it from the mountaintops, spread it all over the internet, Facebook it, tweet it, browbeat people with it. But first of all, do that to your own thoughts. First of all, convert yourself. Whatever it is that you truly believe, the things that you believe are true in this world, you still need to convert yourself 100% to those. And of course, our beliefs, our loves, philosophical loves, can change from time to time, but whatever they are, whatever it is that we truly believe, we need to convert ourselves and then convert everybody else. Now, the two main things that I love in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras are what I'm presenting in this webinar. I mentioned a moment ago that really all you need is the first one. Yoga is the inhibition of the modifications of the mind, because in that state, that is when you see the seer. That is when the seer is established in his own essential nature. In this sutra, which is near the beginning of the second book of the Yoga Sutras, the Sadhanapada, in a very interesting discussion in Taimani's Science of Yoga on the theory of the kleshas or hindrances. Now, in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the hindrances are a bit different to what we think of them in ordinary life. When we think of what are our hindrances or afflictions, we're apt to think of things outside of ourselves. For example, noisy neighbors, or I don't know what other hindrances. Yeah, problematic neighbors is a popular one. Being underpaid, overworked. These are the hindrances. But in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the hindrances are all internal, and they begin, first of all, with the fundamental problem for all human beings, which is avidya, and that is the cause of all the other afflictions in life. It's the cause of all of your afflictions, not just the internal ones, but also the external ones. Because without these afflictions, these internal afflictions, you would not have any external afflictions. You wouldn't mind what happened. It wouldn't make any difference to you whether the neighbors were noisy or quiet. So this is Sutra 3 in the second book of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. The lack of awareness of reality, avidya, the sense of egoism or I-amness, asmita, attractions and repulsions towards objects, raga, dvesha, and instinctive self-preservation, abhinivesha, are the great afflictions or causes of all miseries in life. So the great afflictions and causes of all miseries in life begin with the fundamental lack of knowledge of your real self, or avidya. This gives rise to the sense of I-amness, and the sense of I-amness means here not just ahankara, the I-making principle, but really identifying the I with the projections. Attractions and repulsions towards objects, and instinctive self-preservation. In Taimani's translation, I think he had there a strong desire for life or something like that, which can be a bit confusing. It's the strong desire for life in the body-mind complex. It's the strong attachment to the body and the mind, which is really what our desire for life consists of. So instinctive self-preservation are the great afflictions or causes of all miseries in life. Now, not of these, why I love this sutra is because this is not only a description of the kleshas or hindrances, but this is also a description of every single thought, every single one of us, and every single human being has ever or will ever have, had or have. So this might seem like a strange thing to say, but these 5 elements are the 5 elements of every thought you have. And later on, if you want, you can experiment conceptually and try to come up with a thought which was not based on the fundamental ignorance of your real nature, that did not have an element of egoism or I-amness in it, that was not based on attractions and repulsions towards objects, and objects also include thoughts, by the way. Is there any thought that you have ever had that was not based on likes and dislikes? I don't think so. And is there any thought that any of us have ever had that was not self-referential, that was not based on self-preservation? I went to an interesting talk on mindfulness, a very deep talk on mindfulness at a national convention here last year or the year before, I can't remember, in which the speaker mentioned that recently there has been a discovery of what scientists are calling the me network, which is this automatic self-referential loop that brings everything back, that when the mind is not engaged in anything else specifically, such as concentrating on a task or meditation, when our minds are not engaged in anything specifically, what is always going on is this self-referential me network loop, which is shoring up and building up the me, or the self, the lower self. And that's always going on in the background. So this instinctive self-preservation is more than just self-preservation. It's also instinctive, permanent, self-referential everything. So every single thought we have. And this is so important because if we're thinking in terms of universal brotherhood of humanity, this is also one thing that we all have in common. And we all have it in common with Adolf Hitler as well. Adolf Hitler is just an exaggerated, these 5 kleshas, it's just an exaggerated version of me, not something qualitatively different. It's not a pleasant thought, but Adolf Hitler is not qualitatively different to me. He is quantitatively different to me. But both of us have the same fundamental disease, avidya, and all of the things that flow on from that. Now, avidya is not just a passive thing. That's another reason this is such an important teaching. We tend to think of ignorance as simply an absence of knowledge, but ignorance is not just an absence of knowledge. Ignorance has got something in place of the knowledge of self. It's got some projections in place of the knowledge of the self. Ignorance in ordinary parlance is not such a problem. For example, my ignorance of the Spanish language is not going to have any disastrous flow-on effects unless maybe I'm trying to get around Spain in some emergency situation. Ignorance of Spanish is quite a limited type of ignorance. But other types of ignorance have a more of a flow-on effect, like not knowing which way is up, not knowing what is important in life. These things have quite serious flow-on effects. So what is avidya? We've said quite a lot about it, but let's remember from, I think, the first session, I mentioned that avidya is the personal equivalent of maya. Avidya is in the microcosm what maya, the creative power of the universe, is in the macrocosm. So the word maya is a shakti. Maya is not some kind of a mistake or an error, and that's why people call their beloved daughters Maya. Maya is the creative power of Brahman. Maya is the power of Brahman to project the world through these twin powers, Vikshepa Shakti, projection or superimposition, and Avarana Shakti, veiling or concealment. So the world is projected onto the screen of the self, and at the same time, the underlying reality, which is the screen, is concealed, hence the illusion. Exactly the same thing happens with every thought that we have. Avidya is the creative power of thought, and it's a reflection in the microcosm of Maya. Like Maya, our thoughts, every single thought, has the twin powers and twin flaws of projection and superimposition, veiling or concealment. So every thought that we have is a projection. Now it might be a projection of a very good idea, like how to get from A to B. It could be a projection of the universal theory of gravitation, or the theory of universal gravitation, which helps us get from London to Australia in an aircraft. That is a projection of thought. But every thought is also a superimposition on the real. So every thought conceals the real. And why is this important? Because if we go back to the first sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, yoga or union or self-realization is the cessation of the modifications of the mind. Yoga is the cessation of projection. Yoga is the cessation of veiling or concealment. So our thoughts are both our problem and also the way to the solution. You know, they are the way. The road up is the same as the road down is the saying. Yeah, the way up is the same as the way down. It's just looked at from a different point of view. So self-mastery in Theosophy and self-mastery in yoga and self-mastery in Vedanta consists of two things. First and foremost, seeing. And secondly, cessation of the modifications of the mind. Now, I have taken up quite a long time in this session, and due to constant disappointment of writing things in the chat box, which I ignore due to my inability to handle this webinar situation, everybody has become silent. So that's okay, because it will leave me a couple of minutes for this one last slide. And the slide that I'm not showing now, I will show and discuss in a subsequent session. But I just want to quickly go over this. This is the theory of the attenuation of the kleshas. The kleshas are the afflictions, avidya, I amness, attractions and repulsions towards objects, and instinctive self-preservation, which are the cause of all our problems in life, including the environmental problematic, global warming, etc., noisy neighbours, all caused by these internal afflictions. And in the same book or section of the Yoga Sutras, there is a section on the attenuation or thinning out of these afflictions. These afflictions will be there so long as we are embodied, but they can be thinned out to the point of no problem at all. So there are two roads here, and there are two roads that we can take. There are two paths that we can take through any given life. There are two paths we can take through any given day. There are two paths we can take through any given moment. One leads to rebirth and the other leads to liberation. And where we say the path to rebirth, rebirth is not intrinsically the problem. It is not the wheel of birth and death that is the problem. It is our running on that wheel like a poor rat in an experiment that is the problem. It is our attachment to the wheel of birth and death that is the problem. So every thought, every moment, every action, every day, every life is always either on one road or another. You know, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Now let's look at the bottom of this diagram, which is very important. Every single action and every single thought is based on subconscious impressions resulting from past deeds, determined mainly by ignorance, attraction and repulsion, I amness, and the thirst for life. Every single thought and every single action of ours is based on subconscious impression, samskaras and vasanas, resulting from past deeds. They may be past deeds in another life. They may be past deeds on another planet. They may be past deeds last week, or they may be past deeds this morning. Everything we do is based on past deeds. Now, because of the kleshas, avidya, I amness, etc., our past deeds are mainly influenced by avidya. The nescience, or type of knowledge, lower order knowledge, that rules the ordinary human life. Avidya then leads to klesha-conditioned mental activity. Mental activity that is conditioned by I amness, attractions and repulsions towards objects, ignorance, instinctive self-preservation. So most of our actions, for those who are on the road to continual rebirth in a state of attachment and ignorance, attached to the vehicles, most of our actions are klesha conditioned. Now most of our thoughts are klesha conditioned. Now thoughts that are largely conditioned by ignorance, I amness, attractions and repulsions towards sensory objects, etc., these kind of thoughts naturally result in non-meritorious actions, wrong actions, actions that are going to cause you problems further on. It's like a positive feedback loop. You know, nothing works like excess. So the more ignorance you have, the more ignorant actions that you will perform, which will condition the mind further and lead to subconscious impressions, mostly klesha conditioned. So then again, we go back. Every thought of mine has now been further deeply conditioned. It's like you get further and further bogged down what happens on the road to liberation. And the road to liberation doesn't mean even final liberation. It is the thinning out of the kleshas. So how does that happen? Well, all of my actions and thoughts are based on subconscious impressions resulting from past deeds. But before I came across the Theosophy and the Theosophical Society in 1979, I was absolutely clueless about there being any purpose or meaning in life. And I had no sense really of right or wrong. You know, I just really was quite vapid. So when I came across Theosophy and Vedanta and Krishnji and Ramana Maharshi, etc. in 1978, it was actually, these teachings started to condition my mind in a different way. They started to wriggle themselves into my body-mind complex. And naturally, when you hear these teachings and you love them and you believe them, then a natural flow-on effect is a certain degree of discrimination between the real and the unreal starts to kick in, just slightly. You're not just completely clueless anymore. Somebody has come along and told you which way is up, and for the first time, there is such a thing as up. I had no idea. I was just on this, wheel like a rat in a lab experiment. I had absolutely no idea there was any way up or any way out of here or any better way to live or any really right or wrong. So I became slightly more discerning, freeze frame there, just to point out that, just very slightly more discerning. And that led to mental activity that gets conditioned slightly differently. There's a little bit, the same old ignorance is there, but it's a little bit thinned out. It's a little bit polluted by right knowledge in a way. That leads to slightly better action, meritorious action. Meritorious action, or punya karma, is things that are going to help you in the future, things that are going to be less dragging you down, less likely to move you away from those moments where you see the seer. And this right action creates subconscious impressions. All action creates subconscious impressions, and right action and right thought create subconscious impressions that are more likely to lead to right action and right thought in the next moment or the next year or the next lifetime. So this diagram is a very clear representation of how the how actually works. First of all, you hear the teachings. Those teachings influence you. I mean, we're always conditioned by something. We may as well be conditioned by right thoughts. We may as well be conditioned by helpful, healthy, wholesome teachings which lead to liberation. They condition you. All your thoughts are conditioned, but we need to train our thoughts to be all conditioned by these teachings. And when all of our thoughts are conditioned by these teachings, there will be no non-meritorious action, and the subconscious impressions that those good, healthy, helpful actions, those life-affirming, light-filled actions create subconscious impressions which cause you to behave better and better and better in the future. So this is the road to liberation in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Just put in a single diagram, which I took and adapted from Feuerstein's book on yoga, A Reappraisal of Yoga, Feuerstein and Miller, A Reappraisal of Yoga, their chart or teaching on the attenuation of the kleshas. So I think that's really quite enough for today. In the next session, I've decided that what I'm going to do is try to present a chart, a chronology chart of our ancestry in the Theosophical Society, the ancestry of Theosophy going back to the Vedic period, which I read yesterday has now been pushed back to at least 8000 BC, up until 1875, and then, including the works of Krishnji. And yes, there is homework. And then in session 6, we're going to be looking at the real work of the Theosophical Society based on these teachings. and also a number of very interesting teachings about what learning really is and how to learn in the Vedic way. So thank you all very much for listening to this rather lengthy dissertation. And if you have any questions, you could feel free to send them to Jim and he can forward them to me and I can answer them later on. I don't think I'll ever get webinar friendly, but thank you very much. Until next week, bye-bye.